It was a sunny Tuesday morning when James Brooks made his weekly visit to the downtown branch of Bank. As the successful CEO of a thriving tech startup, James had become a familiar face at this location, making deposits and checking on the status of his various accounts on a regular basis. Today's trip was no different from the dozens he had made before. Dressed impeccably in a tailored suit, James strode through the bank's revolving doors with a briefcase in hand, his confident stride betraying the years of hard work and determination that had brought him to this point in his career. Approaching the teller's stations, James patiently waited his turn, observing the steady flow of customers conducting their own financial transactions. After a short wait, he stepped up to the window occupied by a stern-looking woman named Susan. "Good morning," James said politely, flashing the teller a warm smile. "I'd like to make a deposit, please." Susan barely acknowledged his greeting, her eyes narrowing as she studied James' face. "Can I see your ID?" she asked in a clipped tone, her hand extended. Slightly taken aback by the teller's brusque manner, James retrieved his driver's license from his wallet and handed it to her. "Of course," he replied, wondering if he had done something to upset her. Susan scrutinized the ID for several long moments, her lips pursed in an expression of obvious distrust. Finally, she looked up and fixed James with a penetrating stare. "This doesn't look like you," she declared, her voice laced with suspicion. James blinked in surprise. "I can assure you that is my driver's license," he said, hoping to diffuse the situation. "I'm a regular customer here, and I've never had any issues with my identification before." But Susan was unconvinced. "Well, I'm going to need to see some additional forms of ID to verify your identity," she insisted, her tone brooking no argument. Frowning, James reached into his pocket and retrieved his business card, which he handed to the teller. "As you can see, I'm the CEO of Brooks Technology Solutions. I've been banking with Ackman for the past 5 years and have never had any trouble with my accounts." Susan's eyes widened slightly as she read the card, but her expression remained skeptical. "That's all well and good, but I still need to see more identification before I can process your deposit," she said firmly. James felt a trickle of irritation creep up his spine. He had never encountered this level of scrutiny or mistrust from the bank's employees before, and he couldn't help but wonder if it had something to do with the color of his skin. Nonetheless, he dutifully produced his passport and a copy of his most recent utility bill, handing them over to the teller. As Susan examined the documents, James noticed several other customers glancing in his direction, their expressions ranging from curiosity to outright concern. He shifted uncomfortably, acutely aware of the growing tension in the air. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Susan returned the ID and documents to James, her lips tightening into a thin line. "All right, I suppose everything checks out," she said, her tone dripping with reluctance. "How much would you like to deposit today?" James hesitated, his initial goodwill towards the teller having been thoroughly eroded by her unwarranted suspicion and condescending manner. Nevertheless, he forced himself to remain calm and professional. "I'd like to make a deposit of $20,000, he replied, handing over the cash. As Susan counted the bills, James couldn't help but notice the way her brow furrowed in what appeared to be disbelief. It was as if she simply couldn't fathom that a black man could be in possession of such a large sum of money. The teller's unspoken judgment stung, and James felt a familiar pang of frustration and resentment. How many times had he encountered this kind of prejudice, this assumption that he was somehow less than, simply because of the color of his skin? It was a burden he had carried his entire life, and one that he had hoped he had left behind as he climbed the corporate ladder and achieved a level of success that many would envy. But here he was, once again being treated like a second-class citizen, his competence and integrity called into question simply because he didn't fit the mold of what a respectable customer was supposed to look like. James took a deep breath, willing himself to remain composed as Susan finished processing the deposit. When she finally handed him his receipt, he offered her a polite nod, but the warmth had drained from his expression. "Thank you," he said simply, before turning and making his way towards the exit, his mind already racing with thoughts of how he would address this latest injustice. As James Brooks made his way towards the exit of the Bank branch, he couldn't shake the lingering sense of unease and frustration that had settled over him. The tellers, Susan's, latent mistrust and condescension had left him feeling deeply unsettled, a familiar yet no less painful experience he had endured far too many times in his life. James knew that as a successful black businessman, he was no stranger to discrimination and prejudice. Over the years, he had encountered countless instances where his competence and character had been called into question simply because of the color of his skin. Whether it was being followed by security guards in high-end stores, being denied service at restaurants, or being subjected to intrusive questioning by law enforcement, James had grown accustomed to the subtle and not-so-subtle ways in which society sought to marginalize and diminish him. But this particular encounter at the bank felt different, somehow more personal and egregious. Susan's obvious suspicion and disbelief had struck a deep chord within him, reminding him of the countless times he had been made to feel like an outsider, a perpetual guest in a world that should rightfully be his. As he walked, James couldn't help but replay the interaction in his mind, dissecting every word, every gesture, every fleeting expression on the teller's face. The way she had scrutinized his ID, as if searching for some flaw or inconsistency. The condescending tone she had used when demanding additional forms of identification, as if he were some common criminal trying to pull off an elaborate scheme. And then there was the way she had reacted to his business card, her eyes widening ever so slightly, not with recognition or respect, but rather with what seemed like a mixture of surprise and disbelief. It was as if she simply couldn't fathom the idea that a black man could be the CEO of a successful tech company, that he could have the kind of wealth and status that would warrant such a prominent position. James clenched his jaw, his hands balling into tight fists at his sides. He knew that he should not have been surprised by Susan's behavior. This was, unfortunately, all too common an experience for people of color in this country. And yet, the sting of it, the sheer injustice of it, never seemed to dull. As he stepped outside, James paused for a moment, taking a deep breath and trying to regain his composure. He knew that he could not afford to let this incident distract or upset him. He had a business to run, a company to lead. But the more he thought about it, the more his anger and indignation began to simmer beneath the surface. Suddenly, a movement out of the corner of his eye caught his attention. Glancing over, he saw a group of customers who had been in the bank, watching the exchange between him and Susan with a mix of concern and curiosity. Some of them were even shaking their heads, their expressions mirroring the outrage and disbelief that James himself was feeling. In that moment, James realized that his experience was not his alone. It was a shared one, a testament to the endemic racism and discrimination that plagued not just the banking industry, but society as a whole. And he knew that he could no longer remain silent, that he had a responsibility to use his platform and his influence to speak out against these injustices, to demand change and accountability. With a renewed sense of purpose, James began to formulate a plan in his mind. He would start by filing a formal complaint with the bank's corporate office, detailing the incident and the teller's unacceptable behavior. But that would only be the beginning. He would use this as an opportunity to push for broader reforms, to challenge the systemic biases and prejudices that had been allowed to fester for far too long. As he made his way towards his car, James couldn't help but feel a surge of determination and resolve. He may have been humiliated and disrespected today, but he would not let that define him. Instead, he would turn this experience into a catalyst for change, a rallying cry for a more just and equitable world, one in which people of all backgrounds could be treated with the dignity and respect they deserved. As James Brooks made his way back to the teller's window, his mind was racing with a mixture of anger, determination, and a steadfast resolve to address the blatant injustice he had just experienced. The condescending treatment from the bank employee, Susan, had left him feeling deeply unsettled and disrespected, reigniting a familiar sense of frustration that he had long grappled with as a successful black businessman. Approaching the counter, James took a deep breath and addressed Susan in as calm and professional a tone as he could muster. "Excuse me, but I'd like to speak to a manager about the way I was just treated," he said, his voice steady but with an undercurrent of barely contained emotion. Susan's eyes widened slightly, and she immediately adopted a defensive posture. "I'm not sure what the problem is, sir," she replied, her tone terse and dismissive. "I was simply following our standard protocols to verify your identity, as I do with all of our customers." James felt his jaw tighten, the muscles in his neck tensing with the effort to maintain his composure. "Standard protocols?" he repeated, his voice rising slightly. I'm a long-standing, trusted customer of this bank, and I've never been subjected to this level of scrutiny and mistrust before. The growing tension in the air was palpable, and James could feel the eyes of the other customers in the bank turning towards them, their expressions ranging from curiosity to outright concern. Well, perhaps if you had presented your identification properly in the first place, we wouldn't be having this issue, Susan retorted, her tone dripping with condescension. James felt a surge of indignation wash over him. Presented my identification properly? He echoed, his voice rising further. I followed every single one of your requests, and you still refused to believe that I was who I said I was. This has nothing to do with how I presented my documents, and everything to do with the fact that I'm a black man in your eyes. The accusation hung in the air, and James could see a flicker of unease cross Susan's features. But before she could respond, a middle-aged man in a suit approached the counter, his expression stern. Is there a problem here? The man, who James assumed was the bank manager, asked, his gaze shifting between the teller and the irate customer. Susan straightened her posture, her chin lifting slightly. This customer is causing a scene and refusing to follow our standard identification procedures, she said, her voice tinged with a hint of triumph. James felt his temper flare, and he turned to face the manager, his eyes narrowing. I'm not the one causing a scene here, he retorted. I'm a valued customer of this bank, and I'm being treated with nothing but suspicion and disrespect simply because of the color of my skin. The manager's brow furrowed, and he held up a hand in a placating gesture. Sir, I apologize for the misunderstanding, but I'm sure there's been some sort of miscommunication here. Why don't we all take a step back and try to resolve this in a calm and professional manner? James felt the anger bubbling up inside him, threatening to boil over. Miscommunication? He scoffed, his voice dripping with sarcasm. There's no miscommunication here. This teller has made it abundantly clear that she doesn't trust me, and she's treating me like a criminal simply because I'm a black man. The manager's expression hardened, and he glanced over at Susan, who was now visibly flustered. Ms. Johnson, perhaps we could have a word in private, he said, his tone brooking no argument. Susan opened her mouth to protest, but the manager held up a hand, silencing her. I think it's best if we address this matter away from the other customers, he said, his gaze sweeping over the growing crowd that had gathered around the confrontation. James watched as the manager and the teller retreated to a nearby office, the tension in the air palpable. He could feel the eyes of the other customers upon him, some of them offering sympathetic glances, others looking on with a mix of curiosity and unease. As he waited for the manager to return, James felt a sense of trepidation wash over him. He knew that he had done nothing wrong, that his only crime was the color of his skin, and yet he couldn't shake the feeling that he was the one who was going to be punished for the teller's blatant racism and discriminatory behavior. With a heavy sigh, James steeled himself for whatever was to come, determined to stand his ground and fight for the respect and dignity that he knew he deserved. As James Brooks waited anxiously for the bank manager to return, he felt a growing sense of dread and resignation wash over him. Despite his best efforts to remain calm and composed, the humiliation and indignation he had experienced at the hands of the teller, Susan, had left him feeling deeply unsettled and on edge. The confrontation had drawn the attention of several other customers, who now watched the unfolding drama with a mixture of sympathy and unease. James could feel their eyes upon him, their expressions ranging from concern to outright disbelief at the blatant discrimination he had endured. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the manager emerged from the nearby office, his face set in a somber expression. Approaching James, he cleared his throat and spoke in a measured tone. Sir, I want to apologize for the way you were treated here today, the manager said, his gaze steadily meeting James' own. The teller's behavior was unacceptable, and I can assure you that it does not reflect the values or policies of this bank. James felt a surge of bitter frustration rise within him. Unacceptable, he echoed, his voice dripping with contempt. This wasn't some minor inconvenience or misunderstanding. I was publicly humiliated and treated like a criminal, all because of the color of my skin. The manager winced, his expression darkening. I understand your anger, and I can assure you that we take this matter very seriously. We will be conducting a thorough investigation and taking appropriate disciplinary action against the teller. James scoffed, his arms crossing over his chest. Disciplinary action? That's it," he demanded, his voice rising in volume. "This kind of racist behavior has been allowed to fester for far too long, and a slap on the wrist is not going to cut it." The manager held up a placating hand. "I can assure you that we will be taking significant steps to address this issue, both within our organization and in the broader community," he said, his tone tinged with a hint of desperation. "But in the meantime, I must ask that you refrain from causing any further disruption here." James felt his blood boil at the implication. "Disruption?" He spat, his eyes narrowing to slits. "I'm not the one who caused a disruption here. That was your teller, with her blatant racism and discriminatory behavior. And now you're telling me that I'm the one who needs to back down." The manager's expression hardened, and he straightened his posture. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave the premises," he said, his voice firm. "If you continue to create a disturbance, I'll have no choice but to call the authorities." James felt his heart racing, the blood pounding in his ears. He knew that he should walk away, that escalating the situation further would only lead to more trouble. But the sheer injustice of it all, the latent disrespect and lack of accountability, was simply too much for him to bear. "Call the authorities?" He spat, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Go ahead, call them. I'm sure they'll be just as eager to harass and intimidate a successful black man as your teller was." The manager's face flushed with anger, and he gestured towards the exit. "I'm warning you, sir," he said, his tone laced with barely contained rage. "If you don't leave this bank immediately, I will have no choice but to have you removed." James glared at the manager, his fists clenched at his sides. For a moment, he considered pushing back, of standing his ground and refusing to be cowed by their blatant display of racism and disrespect. But as he looked around at the other customers, who were now watching the confrontation with a mix of fear and concern, he knew that it would only serve to further inflame the situation. With a heavy heart, James turned and stalked towards the exit, his shoulders hunched and his jaw set in a tight line. As he pushed through the revolving doors, he could feel the eyes of the other customers upon him, their expressions ranging from sympathy to judgment. James felt a wave of shame and humiliation wash over him, his pride and sense of self-worth shattered by the degrading experience he had just endured. And as he made his way to his car, a single thought echoed in his mind. This was not the last time he would have to confront the ugly realities of racism in America. As James Brooks sat in his car, his hands gripping the steering wheel in a white-knuckled grip, a maelstrom of emotions swirled within him. Anger, humiliation, and a deep sense of disappointment had all coalesced into a toxic cocktail that threatened to overwhelm him. The blatant racism and disrespect he had endured at the hands of the bank teller, Susan, and the subsequent failure of the bank's manager to properly address the issue had left him feeling powerless and betrayed. It was a familiar and deeply frustrating feeling, one that he had grappled with throughout his life as a successful black businessman navigating the often treacherous waters of corporate America. But this time, James was determined not to let it slide. The humiliation he had suffered, the public degradation he had been forced to endure, was simply too much to ignore. This was not just a personal affront, but a systemic problem that needed to be addressed, and he knew that he had the power and the platform to do it. With a resolute determination, James reached for his phone and began dialing the number for the bank's corporate office. As he listened to the automated menu options, his mind raced with the words he would use to convey the gravity of the situation and the urgent need for action. Finally, a human voice answered on the other end of the line, and James launched into his impassioned explanation of the events that had transpired at the downtown branch. He described, in meticulous detail, the teller's blatant mistrust and suspicion, the way she had demanded multiple forms of identification despite his clear status as a long-standing customer. He recounted the escalating confrontation, the way the teller had stubbornly refused to acknowledge her own prejudice and discriminatory behavior. And he detailed the manager's woefully inadequate response, the way the man had essentially sided with the teller and attempted to strong-arm him into leaving the premises. Throughout his retelling, James could feel the anger and indignation bubbling up within him, his voice trembling with barely contained emotion. But he refused to be cowed or silenced, determined to ensure that his story was heard and that the bank was held accountable for the egregious and unacceptable actions of its employees. The representative on the other end of the line listened intently, her own voice laced with a mixture of concern and sympathy. Mr. Brooks, I can assure you that we take this matter very seriously, she said, her tone grave. We will launch a full investigation into this incident and take appropriate disciplinary action against the teller and the manager involved. James let out a humorless laugh, his grip on the phone tightening. Disciplinary action? He scoffed. That's not enough. This kind of racist behavior has been allowed to fester for far too long, and a simple slap on the wrist is not going to cut it. The representative paused, and James could almost feel the weight of her words as she chose them carefully. I understand your frustration, Mr. Brooks, and I can assure you that we will be taking significant steps to address this issue. We will be reviewing our training protocols, our hiring practices, and our overall approach to diversity and inclusion within the organization. James nodded, his jaw set in a tight line. That's a good start, he said, his voice low and measured. But I want to be involved in that process. I want to ensure that real, tangible changes are made, not just empty promises or superficial gestures. The representative responded quickly, her tone reassuring. Absolutely, Mr. Brooks. We would be honored to have your input and involvement in shaping our response to this incident. We recognize the importance of your voice and your perspective in driving meaningful change. James felt a small measure of relief wash over him, but he knew that this was only the beginning. The fight against systemic racism and discrimination was a long and arduous one, and he was prepared to be in it for the long haul. But for now, he knew that he had taken the first step, and that was something to be proud of. With a deep breath, he thanked the representative and ended the call, already mentally preparing for the next phase of this battle. He knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but he was more determined than ever to see it through, for himself, for his community, and for the countless others who had endured the same kind of humiliation and injustice. As the investigation into the incident at the downtown Acme Bank branch unfolded, the bank's corporate leadership found themselves facing a growing sense of dread and apprehension. What had initially seemed like a relatively straightforward case of employee misconduct had quickly escalated into a potentially damaging public relations crisis, one that threatened to shine a harsh spotlight on the organization's long-standing issues with diversity, equity, and inclusion. At the heart of the matter was James Brooks, the successful black businessman whose experience with the racist teller, Susan, had sparked the investigation. The corporate team had quickly recognized the gravity of the situation, acknowledging the need to take swift and decisive action to address the blatant discrimination and disrespect that James had endured. However, as the investigation delved deeper into the details of the incident, a shocking revelation came to light, one that would ultimately reshape the entire narrative and force the bank's leadership to confront their own deeply ingrained biases and shortcomings. It turned out that James Brooks was not just any customer. He was, in fact, one of the bank's largest individual investors and most prominent donors. His tech startup, Brooks Technology Solutions, had been a reliable source of revenue and goodwill for the institution for years, and his personal wealth and influence within the community were substantial. The realization hit the corporate team like a sucker punch, their faces falling as they grappled with the implications of their findings. Susan, the teller whose discriminatory behavior had sparked the entire debacle, had been completely unaware of James' status and importance to the bank, a fact that only served to compound the egregious nature of her actions. "This is a nightmare," one of the executives muttered, burying his head in his hands. "We've not only allowed blatant racism to occur under our watch, but we've managed to antagonize one of our most valuable customers in the process." The others in the room nodded grimly, their expressions mirroring the sense of dread and apprehension that had taken hold. They knew that the fallout from this incident had the potential to be catastrophic, both in terms of the bank's reputation and its bottom line. "We need to act quickly and decisively," another executive chimed in, her voice tinged with a hint of desperation. "This could undo years of goodwill and trust that we've worked so hard to build with the community." The team launched into a flurry of discussions, debating the best course of action and weighing the potential consequences of each possible response. They knew that they could not simply sweep this under the rug or offer a half-hearted apology. The stakes were too high, and the moral imperative too great. Finally, after hours of intense deliberation, the corporate leadership reached a consensus. They would issue a formal, unequivocal apology to James Brooks, acknowledging the egregious nature of the teller's actions and the bank's failure to properly address the situation. Additionally, they would announce a series of sweeping reforms, including mandatory diversity and inclusion training for all employees, a comprehensive review of hiring and promotion practices, and the creation of a new position, a Chief Diversity Officer, to oversee and champion these efforts. The team knew that these measures would be costly, both financially and in terms of the time and resources required to implement them, but they also recognized that the cost of inaction would be far greater, a potential public relations disaster that could irreparably damage the bank's reputation and erode the trust of the very community it sought to serve. As the plan was finalized and the public announcement prepared, a palpable sense of tension and anticipation filled the air. The corporate team knew that they were walking a fine line, that the success or failure of their response would hinge on their ability to strike the right balance between contrition, accountability, and a genuine commitment to change. But for James Brooks, the stakes were even higher. This was not just about restoring the bank's reputation or safeguarding its financial interests. It was about demanding the dignity, respect, and equal treatment that he and countless others like him had been denied for far too long. And he was determined to see this through, no matter the cost. In the aftermath of the explosive incident at the downtown Bank branch, the bank's corporate leadership found themselves in the unforgiving glare of public scrutiny. The revelations that the victim of the racist treatment, James Brooks, was in fact one of the bank's largest individual investors and donors had sent shockwaves through the organization, forcing them to confront the uncomfortable truth about their own systemic biases and shortcomings. With the stakes higher than ever, the corporate team wasted no time in crafting a comprehensive response to the crisis. They began by issuing a formal public apology to James, acknowledging the egregious nature of the teller's actions and the bank's failure to properly address the situation. "We are deeply sorry for the unacceptable treatment Mr. Brooks experienced at the hands of our employee," the statement read. "This incident is a clear violation of our core values and commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. We recognize that we have fallen short in our responsibilities, and we are committed to taking immediate and meaningful action to ensure that this never happens again." The apology was just the beginning, however, as the bank's leadership went on to unveil a sweeping set of reforms and initiatives aimed at addressing the root causes of the problem. At the forefront of these efforts was the creation of a new Chief Diversity Officer position, a high-level role that would be responsible for overseeing and championing the bank's diversity and inclusion efforts. "We understand that meaningful change requires more than just words," the bank's CEO said in a press conference announcing the new position. "That's why we're committed to investing in a dedicated leader who will be empowered to drive real, tangible progress in this area." In addition to the new executive role, the bank also announced mandatory diversity and inclusion training for all of its employees, from tellers and customer service representatives to executives and board members. The training would cover topics such as unconscious bias, cultural competency, and effective strategies for promoting equity and inclusion in the workplace. "We recognize that this is not just an issue of individual behavior," the CEO continued, "but a systemic problem that requires a comprehensive, organization-wide approach. That's why we're committed to embedding these values and practices into every aspect of our operations, from hiring and promotions to the way we interact with our customers and the communities we serve." James Brooks, who had been invited to attend the press conference, listened intently as the bank's leaders outlined their plans for reform. While he was encouraged by the sense of urgency and the apparent sincerity of their commitments, he knew that the true test would come in the months and years ahead as the bank worked to turn these words into meaningful, lasting change. As the press conference drew to a close, James stepped up to the podium, his gaze sweeping across the assembled media and bank personnel. "I appreciate the steps that Bank is taking to address this issue," he began, his voice calm and measured. "But I want to be clear that this is just the beginning." He paused, allowing his words to sink in. "Racism and discrimination have been allowed to fester in this industry for far too long, and it's going to take more than a few training sessions and a new executive position to truly root it out. I intend to be a partner in this process, to hold this bank and others like it accountable, and to ensure that real, lasting change is achieved." The bank's CEO nodded solemnly, his expression one of acknowledgement and respect. "We welcome your partnership, Mr. Brooks. We know that the road ahead will not be easy, but we are committed to doing the hard work necessary to create a more equitable and inclusive banking industry, one that truly serves and reflects the diversity of the communities it serves. As the press conference concluded, James felt a renewed sense of purpose and determination. The battle against systemic racism and discrimination was far from over, but he knew that he had taken a significant step forward. By leveraging his influence and standing up for his principles, he had forced one of the country's largest financial institutions to confront its own biases and shortcomings, and that was a victory worth fighting for. As the fallout from the incident at the downtown Bank branch continued to reverberate, James Brooks found himself at a crossroads. The bank's swift and comprehensive response to the crisis, including a public apology, sweeping reforms, and a commitment to meaningful change, had been a welcome and unexpected development, one that had given him a glimmer of hope that real progress could be made. But even as the bank's leadership had acknowledged their failures and pledged to do better, James couldn't help but feel a lingering sense of frustration and skepticism. He had seen too many empty promises and half-hearted attempts at addressing systemic racism over the course of his career, and he knew that true, lasting change would require a sustained and unwavering commitment from those in positions of power. It was with this mindset that James began to contemplate his next steps. He knew that he couldn't simply walk away from this experience, content to let the bank's leadership handle the situation on their own. After all, he had not only been the victim of the teller's blatant discrimination, but he was also one of the institution's most prominent and influential customers, a fact that had only come to light after the initial confrontation. As he mulled over his options, an idea began to take shape in James' mind. Rather than simply accepting the bank's reforms and moving on, he would use this opportunity to push for even greater change, not just within Bank, but across the entire banking industry. With a renewed sense of purpose, James reached out to the bank's CEO and requested a private meeting. When the two men sat down, James laid out his vision, a comprehensive plan that would not only address the immediate issues highlighted by the incident, but would also tackle the deeper, systemic problems that had allowed such blatant racism and discrimination to persist. "I want to be clear," James said, his gaze unwavering, "that I'm not just looking for a quick fix or a few superficial changes. What I want is a complete overhaul of the way your industry operates, from the way you hire and promote your employees to the ways in which you engage with and serve the communities you claim to represent." The CEO listened intently, his expression a mix of apprehension and fascination. He knew that James was proposing a monumental undertaking, one that would require a significant investment of time, resources, and political capital, but he also recognized the gravity of the situation and the importance of getting it right. "I'm listening, Mr. Brooks," the CEO said, his voice measured. "What exactly did you have in mind?" Over the course of the next several hours, James outlined a detailed plan of action, a multi-pronged approach that would address everything from employee training and recruitment to community outreach and customer service policies. He spoke passionately about the need for greater diversity and inclusion, not just in the bank's workforce, but in its leadership and decision-making processes as well. The CEO was initially skeptical, but as James continued to articulate his vision, the man's expression slowly began to shift. He could see the logic and the urgency behind James' proposals, and he recognized that this was a unique opportunity to not only make amends for the bank's past failures, but to also position Acme as a trailblazer in the industry. By the time the meeting drew to a close, the two men had reached an agreement. James would serve as a strategic advisor to the bank, helping to shape and implement the ambitious reform agenda he had outlined. In exchange, Acme would provide financial and logistical support for a new foundation that James planned to establish, one dedicated to combating racism and promoting equity in the banking industry and beyond. As he left the bank's headquarters, James felt a renewed sense of purpose and determination. The road ahead would be long and arduous, but he was more convinced than ever that the fight was worth it. By using his influence and resources to drive real, meaningful change, he could not only help to right the wrongs he had experienced, but also pave the way for a more just and equitable future for all. With a steely resolve, James set to work, determined to leave an indelible mark on the industry and to ensure that the humiliation and indignity he had suffered would not be in vain.